Hi everyone, welcome to our latest virtual tour. Today we're at Weston Park Museum and we're going to be looking at our Ancient Egypt gallery. This is one of our most recent galleries to reopen, and which was opened in February 2020, which feels like quite a while ago now. And it tells the story of Egypt in over 300 artifacts, and we're going to be joined by our Curator of Archaeology, Martha Jasko-Lawrence. We are a charity that looks after Weston Park Museum, the Millennium Gallery and the Graves Gallery as well. So if you've enjoyed today's tour and you would like to show that through a donation, you can donate at museums-sheffield.org.uk/donate. Being closed several times in 2020 had a huge financial impact on our charity, so thank you so much to everybody who does donate today. So if you enjoyed today's tour, we have a favourite comments box below as well. You can ask us questions or pop comments box below. And on that note, I'll pass over to Martha to begin. Thank you very much.
Hello, welcome to Museum Sheffield. My name is Martha Jasko-Lawrence and I'm the Curator of Archaeology. And welcome to our Ancient Egypt gallery. This gallery opened in 2020 and was the idea behind it was to build on our existing ancient Egyptian displays, but because we've got more room and more cases, to not just cover the aspects of ancient Egypt of death and mummification that we talked about before, but to talk about life in ancient Egypt, because we know a lot about ancient Egyptian mummification and burial practices, but the reason the Egyptians were so interested in this is because they lived a full life before they died, and they had a real belief that the afterlife was a continuation of their normal lives, and they needed everything that they would have used in life in the afterlife. And the reason for mummification was because they believed that they needed their bodies in the afterlife. But mummification was something that only very rich people could do. So if you see a mummy on display in a coffin, then you know that that person would have had a lot of money when they were alive. More ordinary people were probably just buried in the sand, or they might have been wrapped in a mat. But obviously in Egypt's dry climate, sometimes their bodies were preserved too. Here at Sheffield, we have two mummies in their coffins in the collection, and here is one of them. This is the coffin and mummy of Nesita Tane Beta Sheru, who I call Nesita for short, because it's easier to say. She was an adult woman, and she lived around about 720 BC in the Thebes region of Egypt. And we know her name because it's written in hieroglyphs on the coffin, and alongside her title, which was Lady of the House. So we know that she was very likely a married woman, and it also has her father's name, Nesiamun, written on the coffin. These are all written in hieroglyphs, which was the main main script used in Egypt, ancient Egypt. For those of you who don't know much about mummification, one of the first steps was to remove the brain through the person's nose. So they got some hooks, gave it a good poke up there, and then they pulled the brain out, and then they would throw the brain away, because in ancient Egyptian belief, the brain wasn't where all the thinking was done, and all the that was your heart. So they really valued the heart, and they would take the heart out and preserve it, and then usually put it back in with the body. And mummification was a long process, and it involved taking out those internal organs, preserving them. It involved stuffing the body with salts and leaving it to dry, and then wrapping it in bandages before placing it in at least one coffin. But the richer you were, the more coffins you had. So in fact with Nesita here, what you can see here, this coffin was just her inner coffin, and she also had a second outer coffin, but unfortunately we don't have that in the collection now. The coffins were richly decorated with hieroglyphs and with pictures, and when we look later at the other coffin and mummy that we have in the collection, you'll see how detailed that decoration could get. People often ask us whether we still have the mummies, and yes, they are both inside the coffins. We've made a decision not to display them in an open way, but in fact with Nasitas we aren't able to open her inner coffin because if you look closely you can see there's a black substance all over it. We're not quite sure what the substance is made of. There's ongoing research projects to find out. This isn't the only ancient Egyptian coffin that would have had this sort of black substance poured over it. And we don't even know whether it was black originally when it was poured on. Some scholars have argued that it was a clear substance that's turned black over time. Some people think if it was black originally, then it was to do with fertility, because black was the colour of fertility in ancient Egypt. There's still a lot more research to do to find out about that. And I realise that actually I forgot to point out that we have actually got two coffins. What I meant was that there's a third coffin that we don't have. So you can see you've got her inner coffin, which is made of something called cartonnage, which is layers of linen and glue, and then the outer coffin that's made of wood. So the ancient Egyptians, as well as mummifying people, they put their mummification skills to mummifying animals as part of their religious worship. And we have an animal mummy here in the collection. This one here, supposedly of an ibis, but it's actually has been CT scanned in the past. And there isn't a whole ibis bird in there, but there are bits of bone and bits of feather. Although you might think this was a fake or somebody's attempt to deceive, actually this was probably a kind of a cheaper version of an acceptable offering at the temple. And you can see an actual more modern Egyptian ibis bird behind it. Other things that they used in worship, this is one of my favourite objects, is this little limestone stele or plaque that you can see has an ear carved in it, and this is known as a listening ear stele. And the idea behind this was it's a sort of personal worship item so that you could speak directly to the gods by speaking your prayers into the ear. And as an archaeologist, I really love those sort of things, those sort of personal things that you can cast yourself back 2,000-3,000 years and imagine you're using it to speak to Anubis or Hathor, whichever god you were worshipping. Because the Egyptians at one point had over 2,000 gods, so obviously people chose particular gods. Either often the town that they lived in would be the cult centre for a particular god, or depending, women might have chosen a particular god, or people of different professions might have particularly worshipped one of those gods. So here you can see this little faience fragment is of the cow goddess Hathor, who was the goddess of music and dancing and motherhood and love. And so often in her worship, music featured, and this little fragment is of something called a sistrum, which was a kind of rattle that they used in worship. So it was a sort of whole sensory experience as well as sound and smells. And another of my favourite objects next to it is this little blue, again made of faience, which is a kind of glassy ceramic that was often used in Egyptian craft. That's a little rattle. And sadly, we can't take it out of the case and give it a shake, but if you do, very gently, you can hear the little beads or whatever it is inside rattling away. I think you would have to listen very carefully. Don't think it would have worked in a noisy worship environment. And again, it's possible that was a rattle for a child. We can't necessarily know. Another object that was used in worship, and this is a fairly rare object. You can see here this wooden doll-like thing on the left-hand side of the shelf. These are popularly known as paddle dolls, and it's made of wood and it's painted with red and black stripes, but it's believed it's actually more of a fertility figurine rather than a child's plaything. And there's perhaps only 200 of them across the world that are known, and we have one here in Sheffield. And some of them sometimes have like a sort of a mop of braided hair attached to the bit at the top. So here you can see we have our second mummy and coffin, and this is of a young girl, about a 14-year-old girl called Jasko-Lawrence, Jedma for short. 14 today still seems quite young, obviously with the age of becoming an adult is 18, but obviously life expectancy in Egypt was shorter, and it's possible even at 14 she could have been married and living in her own household. And you can see the hieroglyphs and the pictures on here are very detailed, and the whole of the coffin, including the back, which you can't see, is covered in these hieroglyphs. A lot of which were sort of set texts, so the idea behind it was a set of particular spells that would have been recited that helped the person who had been mummified and buried, that they would help them in their journey to the afterlife, because the Egyptians believed not that you suddenly died and 5 minutes later you were in the afterlife, that it was a whole long journey, that if you passed through it, and if when your heart was weighed against the feather of truth, if it was lighter than the feather of truth, you would pass through to the afterlife. And if it wasn't, if you had not been a good person during life, then you would be devoured by a creature that was sort of part crocodile, part hippo. So, and you would die forever, a second death. We can open this coffin, and you can see down here we have a photograph of the wrapped mummy inside. And in the past, people would have unwrapped mummies, taken the bandages off, but this damages them, so we don't unwrap them now. And the way we have found out about the age of people and any health problems or whatever they might have had is by CT scanning them and X-raying them. There's and here you can see, here is a slightly larger picture of the CT scan. This is the CT scan of Jedma, and it basically, CT scans, they take slices through the body. So this is showing a section through her chest. These two circles here are her upper arm bones. I think these are her lungs. And then this whole wad of material here, these are the bandages. So as well as her arms being individually bandaged, the whole of her body was bandaged round and round. And underneath the top layer of bandages, but not visible to the eye, only visible on the CT scan, are these white dots, which we've interpreted as probably amulets, because the Egyptians, as well as wearing amulets in life that often were depicted particular gods, also sewed amulets onto the mummy wrappings, again, all as protection for the to help with the journey to the afterlife. And here you can see an X-ray. This is an X-ray of Nesita's coffin. So again, we've been able to confirm that there is actually a body in there. The X-ray was taken quite a long time ago, back in the 1960s. So I think quality would have improved now. But the coffins are very, very heavy, so it's not an easy task to get them X-rayed or CT scanned. Just to show you back here, another one of my favourite objects was that the coffins were, obviously coffin making was a pretty big industry in ancient Egypt, and some of the elements were put together as part of the coffin, and then there were other separate elements. You could kind of customise your coffin as you wish, and often they did that with coffin boards. And here you can see part of a coffin board that depicts a mummy on the back of what's called the Apis bull. So the Apis bull was a bull that the ancient Egypt considered sacred, that they worshipped at the town of Apis, and there was an Apis bull in real life, and when that bull died, it was mummified. So, you often see the bull symbolism in ancient Egypt, and here the bull is carrying the mummy into the afterlife. So that's a separate coffin board, but you can also see on the end of Jebna's coffin here, you also have the same Apis bull carrying presumably Jebna's mummy through to the afterlife. So I'm responsible for all the archaeology collections here at Museum Sheffield, and just want to point out one of the things that I love about the ancient Egyptian collection compared to our wonderful British archaeology collection is that because the climate in Egypt was so dry, or still is so dry, and obviously vast swathes of desert, it means that a lot of organic material, wood and other things like that, have survived that don't survive in our fairly damp British climate. So for example here, this is a stool that is about 3,000 years old. Now it has been partially reconstructed, but you can see these two legs here at the front and this stretcher here are original ancient Egypt. And even the bits at the top are fairly historic because it was reconstructed in around about the 1880s. And then next to it you can see this wonderful lion's paw, again probably another bit of a stool. And stools were something that everybody in Egypt used, and it would have had maybe a rush or a leather seat, which unfortunately hasn't survived. Here we've got a mummified fish, and if you look closely you can see parts of the bandage still. So this is a perch that would have been fished in the River Nile, and it was a popular food, but also we probably have this one because it was mummified and offered as a worship object. Also amazingly, we have some pieces of preserved bread. So this lump, for want of a better term, believe it or not, is 3,500-year-old bread. I don't think it would be very tasty, and it certainly wouldn't be ethical to dip it in some milk or anything to try and soften it up. And finally, I just want to talk about some of the objects in this case that cover jewellery and makeup. The ancient Egyptians, certainly the richer people, were very, very careful about their appearance. We know that from their artworks, so as well as in death, making sure that they looked their best in life, they wanted to. They often shaved their heads and wore wigs. Both men and women and children wore makeup. So we have some things here. This little palette here would have been for mixing makeup. This little jar, again made of that bright blue faience, was probably for keeping makeup in. And here is a mirror. So I think it's hard for us to imagine what mirrors were like in the past because we're so used to being able to look in a mirror and see an almost perfect image of ourselves. Somebody once described it to me that it was probably a bit like looking in the back of a spoon. So you got a reasonable view of yourself, better than nothing. So even when this was new and highly polished, you probably would have been able to make your hair straight and get your mascara on right, but probably not making faces at yourself in the mirror. And again, here we've got a couple of ancient Egyptian sandals. These are again about 3,500 to 3,000 years old, and you can just absolutely imagine wearing those sandals today. Perhaps not on a cold winter day in Britain, but in the nice sunny climate of Egypt. And that's what's been so lovely about putting this new gallery together, is being able to get all these ordinary everyday items out. Some of which obviously were perhaps used by richer people, but you can imagine that the poorer people would have had their own versions, perhaps in less precious materials. And it just really brings ancient Egypt to life, and you can really imagine how people lived their lives.
Hi everyone, well I hope you enjoyed that tour. I certainly did. I think that was really interesting, especially that a piece of bread was found and still in peace from that period. So Martha's going to join us in a second now. She's just finished the tour and we're going to do a quick Q&A with her. So when Martha comes back, we'll ask you a couple of questions. So hi, thank you for that tour. So first one, what is the oldest item that we have on display?
The oldest items that we have on display are probably some flints. Flints can be hard to date, but they could be up to about 80,000 years old. And just like here in Britain, prehistoric people in Egypt used these flints as tools, as knives, awls, all sorts of different things. I've got a nice selection of them on display. Alongside that, we've also got some pottery that's called red-topped blackware, and this is a fairly famous type of ancient Egyptian pottery. And the items that we have were collected by a famous Egyptologist called William Flinders Petrie, who now has a museum in London named after him. He used these pots that he excavated as evidence to prove that there was that the history of Egypt stretched back further than the pharaohs, because actually the pharaohs, the pharaonic period, the period when Egypt was ruled by the pharaohs, is only a period of a few thousand years, but there were obviously people living and dying in Egypt for thousands and thousands of years before that, but people didn't really realise that until Petrie and others did their research.
Oh, that's fascinating. And do you have a favourite item in the collection?
Well, I've got lots of favourites. They're all my favourites.
It's quite a different question.
I think I've mentioned a few in the film, but one of my other favourites is a little coin, a Roman coin, a coin from when Egypt was under Roman rule, so about 2,000 years old, and it was minted in Alexandria, a town in the north of Egypt, but the coin itself was actually found in Sheffield back in 1933. A worker was clearing out a drain and he found this coin, and then it came to the museum in the 1930s. And that's the only ancient Egyptian object that we have in the collection that wasn't actually collected in Egypt. Found in Sheffield.
That's
so
amazing.
it just proves how far the Roman Empire stretched, that a coin that was made in Alexandria in Egypt, who knows, maybe it was brought over by a Roman soldier or got traded here. But yeah, that's one of my favourite objects.
Wow. And so the other items on display then, where have they come from? How have they been collected?
So unlike some of the collections in the museum, the ancient Egyptian collection is kind of the result of probably at least a dozen different collectors, each collecting their own group of objects or type of objects. So the flints I mentioned earlier were collected by a Sheffield vicar, Reverend Alfred, I think, Gatti. Some of the makeup items were collected, and a lot of the amulets were collected by another Sheffield Reverend. They also had a lot of time on their hands, who was called Greville Chester, who became ill because of the not very great conditions in 19th century Sheffield, and he went out to Egypt for his health, became fascinated with ancient Egyptian culture and bought lots of items, which he then I think in his case, donated to Sheffield City Museum as it was then. And at that time in the 19th century and into the early 20th century, Britain was influential, certainly had a lot of political control over Egypt, and then Egypt actually became part of the British Empire. So at the time, these were legal acquisitions, really fitted within even the moral framework of the time, but it's something that we're investigating now, because it all fits into this whole idea of the British Empire, and Britain going out and collecting all this material and bringing it back to their museums back in Britain to showcase the empire. And now we want to kind of turn that story round, and instead of it being about, oh, how great Britain was, investigate how this happened. And it's an ongoing process. You know, you've only got a certain amount of room on a gallery label to discuss these nuances. So although we touch on it, it's something we're going to want to talk about through talks and workshops and just ongoing work. It's not something you do once. It's something we want to carry on with our work right into the future.
Oh, fantastic. That was all really interesting. Thank you so much. So that concludes our tour of the Ancient Egypt Gallery at Weston Park Museum. Thank you everybody for joining us, and do tune in for our other virtual events coming up soon.